Arthur Eugene Delaney was the kind of man who made noise only when there was something worth saying. And since most things worth saying had already been said by someone smarter and older than him, he had grown quiet over the decades in the way that a good fence post grows quiet. Not from weakness, but from having been tested so many times by wind and pressure and weather that it had simply settled into the earth and become part of it. He was 72 years old in the winter of 1978, and he had farmed the same 160 acres of bottom ground along Sycamore Creek in Champaign County, Ohio, since the day his father pressed the deed into his hands and said, without ceremony, "Don't let the bank get it." That had been in 1938, when Arthur was 32 and the Depression had already taken 3 of the Delaney cousins off their land and scattered them to factory towns in Dayton and Cleveland. Arthur had watched them go with the particular sadness of a man who understands that once you leave a piece of ground, you rarely find your way back to it. He had not let the bank get it. The farm was not much to look at from the county road, a white clapboard house with a porch that leaned slightly to the east, a corn crib that had been repaired so many times in so many different decades that it had become a kind of architectural record of hard years and harder winters, and a big red machine shed that Arthur had built himself in 1952 with lumber salvage from a neighbor's collapsed tobacco barn. There was a hog operation that he had scaled back after Dorothy died in 1971, and a small herd of Hereford cattle that he kept more out of habit than economics. The county agricultural agent, a young man named Dale Furrow who had gotten his degree from Ohio State and wore a sport coat to farm visits, had told Arthur 3 separate times in the past 5 years that the cattle weren't penciling out. "I didn't ask you to pencil them," Arthur had said the 3rd time, and Dale Furrow had not brought it up again. The farmhouse smelled the way old Ohio farmhouses always smelled in those years, of kerosene and cornbread, and something else underneath it all, something that was not a smell exactly, but more of a presence, the accumulated weight of generations of people who had eaten and slept and worried and prayed in the same rooms. Dorothy had kept a vegetable garden along the south side of the house, and even 7 years after her death, Arthur still found himself stepping around the ghost of it in summer, avoiding the spot where she used to kneel in her cotton house dress, her hands black with good soil. He had 2 sons. Robert, the elder, had gone to Vietnam in 1968 and come back 2 years later carrying something he never put down and never talked about. He worked at a machine shop in Urbana now, 30 miles east, and called his father on the first Sunday of every month. The calls were short and cordial, like letters between men who respect each other but have run out of easy things to say. The younger son, Paul, had stayed on the land through his 20s and then married a woman from Columbus who had ideas about her life that did not include Champaign County winters, and by 1974 they were living in Phoenix, where Paul sold insurance and sent a Christmas card every year with a photograph of a family that was getting taller and more unfamiliar with every passing December. Arthur did not blame either of his sons. A farm is a hard thing to love if it isn't in your blood, and blood, he had come to understand, skips generations the way a drought does, unpredictably, without malice, simply according to its own logic. So he farmed alone, with the part-time help of a neighbor boy named Gary Troutman, who was 17 and good with machinery and did not talk too much, which Arthur appreciated. And he farmed with his equipment. A man's relationship with his machinery is not something easily explained to someone who has not lived it. It is not sentiment exactly, though sentiment is part of it. It is more like the relationship a sailor has with a boat that has kept him alive in bad water, a mixture of gratitude and respect, and the particular trust that can only be built through shared experience of hardship. Arthur had owned tractors of various ages and conditions over the decades, had borrowed and traded and nursed sick machines back to health in the cold light of a trouble lamp hung from a shed rafter. But there was one machine that stood apart from all the others, one machine that occupied a different place in his understanding, and that was the 1949 Farmall M that sat in the back corner of his machine shed like a retired patriarch, slightly apart from the others, commanding its space without demanding it. He had bought it new in the spring of 1949 from Harmon Equipment in Urbana, and he remembered that day with the clarity that certain days acquire when you understand, even as they are happening, that they are going to matter. The machine was International Harvester Red, a color so specific and so vivid that when people said IH Red in those days, every farmer in earshot knew exactly what shade they meant. not orange, not brick, but that particular deep cardinal that seemed to contain within it something of the soil itself. It weighed nearly 7,000 pounds, and its four-cylinder engine displaced 248 cubic inches and produced somewhere between 35 and 38 horsepower, which was enough, in 1949, to do almost anything a Champaign County corn farmer needed done. The M had an iron seat with no cushioning and no backrest to speak of, mounted on a coil spring that transmitted rather than absorbed road shock, so that after a full day of cultivation, you dismounted feeling like you had been repeatedly struck in the tailbone by a man with a grudge. It had no cab, no heater, no radio, no hydraulics beyond the live power takeoff that Arthur had converted to in 1953. The steering was direct and heavy and honest, the kind of steering that told you exactly what the front wheels were doing at all times and required your full attention and both arms to manage in rough ground. The instruments were minimal: a temperature gauge, an oil pressure gauge, a fuel gauge that Arthur had learned not to trust entirely, and an ammeter that swung lazily between charge and discharge like a man trying to decide whether to get out of his chair. What the Farmall M had, what it possessed in abundance, and what nothing else in Arthur's shed could match, was simplicity. At its beating heart was a magneto-ignition system, a device that generated its own electrical current through the rotation of a permanent magnet, requiring no battery, no alternator, no external electrical system of any kind to produce spark. The engine would run as long as it had fuel and compression and the magneto was spinning, and the magneto would spin as long as the engine was turning. And the engine could be started by hand, with the iron crank handle that lived on a hook beside the shed door, if it came to that. It had come to that, more than once. The M ran on gasoline, regular leaded gasoline, the cheap kind, the kind that in the 1970s was selling for somewhere between 55 and 60 cents a gallon at the Clark station on Route 36, when they had it. Gasoline, Arthur knew, had a particular virtue that diesel fuel lacked. It did not gel in cold weather. Diesel fuel, which contains paraffin waxes, begins to cloud and thicken as temperatures drop, the wax precipitating out of suspension and clogging fuel filters and injection systems. In temperatures below zero, diesel could turn to something resembling petroleum jello. Gasoline, lighter and more volatile, remained liquid and flammable at temperatures far below anything an Ohio winter could produce. Arthur knew this not from any formal education, but from 40 years of farming, from conversations at the IH dealership in winter, from reading Successful Farming and Farm Journal, and occasionally the technical bulletins that International Harvester mailed to registered owners. He knew it the way he knew a dozen other things that the county agricultural agent with his Ohio State degree had never thought to put in a pamphlet, the way a man knows things that he has learned by doing them wrong once and right 100 times after that. He had been offered, in the years since 1949, many opportunities to trade the M away. 3 different implement dealers had approached him. Dale Furrow, the AG agent, had brought it up twice, mentioning USDA loan programs and tax depreciation schedules. His neighbor Carl Brenneman had bought a brand-new John Deere 4440 in 1976 with a fully enclosed cab, air conditioning, and an 8-track tape player, and had told Arthur at the co-op that it was the finest piece of machinery he had ever operated. That farming in the cab of a 4440 was like sitting in a living room while the work happened around you. That's the problem, Arthur had said. Carl Brenneman had looked at him for a moment. What is? If it feels like you're sitting in your living room, Arthur said, you stop paying attention to what the machine is doing. Carl had laughed the indulgent laugh that younger men give to older ones when they suspect they are being told something true but are not ready to hear it. He drove away in his pickup, which had an AM/FM radio and a velour bench seat, and Arthur had stood in the co-op parking lot for a while, watching the dust settle, thinking about something he couldn't quite name. The summer of 1977 brought 2 things to Champaign County that the Urbana Daily Citizen reported on in the same week, which seemed fitting in retrospect: the arrival of Jimmy Carter's new agricultural policy recommendations, and the delivery of 2 brand-new Oshkosh W-Series snowplow trucks to the county highway garage on the edge of town. The trucks were enormous, white with orange striping, equipped with front-mounted 12-foot hydraulic blades and rear-mounted spreaders for sand and salt, powered by Detroit diesel engines that produced 320 horsepower, and, when they were running, made a sound like an industrial building consuming itself. They sat in the county garage through the summer and fall with a kind of patient magnificence, admired by the highway department workers who washed them on Saturdays, and by the county commissioner, Harold Fitch, who had secured the federal matching funds for their purchase, and who mentioned them in almost every public appearance he made from July through November. $40,000 apiece, Harold would say, with the mixture of pride and apology that politicians use when spending other people's money. But you can't put a price on public safety. The highway department superintendent, a barrel-shaped man named Don Kessler, had made sure both trucks were featured in the Urbana Daily Citizen with photographs, and he had written the cut lines himself. County's new Oshkosh W-Series snowplow trucks represent state-of-the-art snow removal capability. Each unit is equipped with Detroit Diesel 8V71 power plant, hydraulic blade controls, and enclosed heated cab. The enclosed heated cab was mentioned in most conversations about the trucks. It seemed to represent something beyond mere comfort, a crossing of a threshold, an arrival at a future where the men who operated heavy equipment in dangerous conditions would no longer have to suffer for their work. Don Kessler talked about the heated cab the way a man talks about something he had wanted for a long time and finally gotten. The state police had their own heavy equipment, maintained through the Ohio State Highway Patrol's district office in Springfield. District Commander Captain Whitfield, a trim man in his late 40s who wore his uniform as though it had been applied with a level, had overseen the acquisition of a third large-format snowplow for the district the previous year, another diesel-powered unit. This one mounted on a heavy International Harvester truck chassis, with an enclosed cab and a citizens band radio for coordination with county units. Young Trooper Billy Howell, 26 and 2 years out of the patrol academy, had been assigned as the operator of the district plow for the winter season. Billy Howell was from Columbus and had never farmed anything in his life. He was the kind of young man who understood the world primarily in terms of specifications, horsepower, response time, chain of command, and who, in the absence of experience, mistook confidence for competence. He had driven the state plow through November's practice runs with an evident pleasure that had less to do with service to the public than with the sensation of operating large, powerful machinery, and he had told his friends at the State Patrol Barracks in Springfield that the assignment was pretty much the best duty in the district. None of this was lost on Arthur Delaney, who heard things, not gossip exactly, but information, the kind that accumulates in a small community the way snow accumulates on a still day, silently and without announcement, until you suddenly realize there is a great deal of it. He heard about the new county plows at the co-op, where he bought his seed corn and occasionally stopped for coffee in the small office with the propane heater and the wall calendar from the Pioneer Seed Company showing a photograph of a perfect ear of yellow corn against a blue sky. He heard about young Trooper Howell from Gary Troutman, who had a cousin in Springfield. He heard about Harold Fitch's federal matching funds and Don Kessler's heated cabs and the Detroit Diesel 8V71 power plants, and he filed all of it away in the same mental ledger where he kept rainfall totals and soil temperatures and the price of number 2 yellow corn at the Springfield elevator. He did not say much about any of it. He had learned long ago that saying things out loud about the reliability of other men's equipment was bad luck, the same way talking about a healthy calf too enthusiastically was bad luck. The land had its own sense of humor, and it reserved its punchlines for people who needed humbling. He spent that fall, as he spent every fall, in the methodical work of preparation. He pulled the Farmall M out of the shed and replaced the spark plugs. He kept Champion H10 plugs on hand, had kept them on hand for 30 years, buying them in packs of 6 at the Champaign County Farm Bureau store. He checked the magneto timing, running his thumbnail around the points to feel for wear. He drained the old oil and put in 30-weight non-detergent, the heavy weight that his father had used and his grandfather probably would have used if his grandfather had owned a tractor, which he had not. He filled the fuel tank with fresh gasoline from his farm tank and added a small amount of Heat brand water remover, the yellow bottle, because water in the fuel line was the one failure mode that could stop a magneto-equipped engine in cold weather. He checked the hand crank, a steel bar about 18 inches long with a bent handle at one end and a square drive end that fit into the corresponding socket at the front of the engine crankshaft. The crank lived on a nail inside the shed door, and Arthur had not used it to start the M in several years, but he checked it every fall the same way he checked every other tool on the farm. Not because he expected to need it, but because a man who checks his tools in September is a man who has them when he needs them in January. The snow blade for the M was a homemade affair, built by Arthur's father-in-law Earl Mayhew in 1953 from 3/16-inch steel plate and 2-inch angle iron, painted highway yellow with paint left over from a county road project that Earl's neighbor had been involved with. It was a straight blade, not angled, not hydraulic, operated by a hand lever that Arthur had to reach forward and down to engage, which required a certain contortion of the upper body that had been easier at 40 than it was at 72. The blade had a steel cutting edge bolted to its bottom, a replaceable wear bar of the kind that implement dealers sold for $1.50 a foot, and it was heavy and stubborn and absolutely reliable in the way that simple, heavy, well-built things are reliable. He bolted the blade to the front mount receiver in late October, the way he did every year, and backed the M into its place in the shed corner, and did not think much more about it until the weather radio started saying things he needed to hear. The weather radio was a Midland brand unit, olive-colored, about the size of a lunchbox, that sat on the kitchen windowsill beside the coffee percolator. Arthur had bought it in 1975 after a particularly bad ice storm had come through without adequate warning and knocked out power to the farm for 4 days, during which 3 of his cattle had gotten into trouble that better warning might have prevented. The radio received broadcasts from the National Weather Service office in Wilmington, Ohio, 24 hours a day, on a VHF frequency that cut through interference that would have fogged an ordinary AM broadcast. He had it on, volume low, on the morning of January 25, 1978, when the National Weather Service issued a statement that he listened to with the concentration he usually reserved for machinery noises, the particular attention of a man trained to extract information from sound. The statement was categorical in a way that government weather statements rarely were. A major winter storm system was developing over the Gulf of Mexico and tracking northeast. A separate Arctic air mass was moving south from Canada. The two systems were going to collide over the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region sometime in the next 18 to 24 hours, and when they did, the result was going to be, in the measured language of the National Weather Service, a significant winter weather event with potentially life-threatening conditions. Arthur turned the volume up. Wind gusts of 50 to 70 miles per hour. Snowfall rates of 1 to 2 inches per hour at peak intensity. Temperature dropped to 20 below 0 Fahrenheit or colder, with wind chills in the range of 40 to 60 below. The NWS statement used the word blizzard 3 times, which Arthur had not heard them do before in 30 years of listening to weather radio. They advised against all unnecessary travel. He went to the barn first and did what he always did before bad weather. Fed the cattle heavy, and made sure the water tank heater was working and the circuit breaker was not tripping. He put an extra bale in the hay manger and checked that the barn doors were latched with the wire loops, not just pushed closed, because wind had a way of finding door edges and working them open. He brought the dog inside, a brown and white beagle mix named Clyde who normally slept in the barn, but who was welcome in the house during serious weather, a privilege he accepted without any false modesty. He filled the kerosene cans in the cellar. He kept 2 5-gallon cans for the living room heater, which was the backup heat source when the propane furnace gave trouble. He checked the propane tank gauge, which read 62%, which was adequate. He filled both of the 5-gallon gasoline cans from the farm tank and carried them to the machine shed, setting them beside the M. He checked the gasoline level in the M's tank, topped it off. He checked the oil again. He called the co-op on the party line. In Champaign County in 1978, there were still party lines in the rural exchanges, 4 and sometimes 5 subscribers sharing a circuit, and you could tell whose call it was by the ring pattern, and you were not supposed to listen in on other people's conversations, and everyone did, to make sure they had no deliveries scheduled that he needed to turn away. He called Gary Troutman's mother to tell Gary not to come in the next few days unless things cleared. Then he sat down in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the farm journal that had come in the mail the previous Thursday, and he read an article about soybean rust management that he had been meaning to get to, and he waited. It came faster than the forecast suggested. By noon on January 25th, the sky had taken on the particular yellow-gray color that Ohio farmers of that era recognized and respected, not the gray of ordinary clouds, but something denser and more committed, a color like old pewter or like the inside of a grain elevator in August. The temperature, which had been in the mid-20s when Arthur fed the cattle that morning, had dropped to 12 degrees by the time he walked back to the house at 11:30. The wind was from the northwest, steady at 20 miles per hour and gusting higher, and the first snow had begun, not the big lazy flakes of a mild snowfall but the small, hard pellets of a serious storm, driven horizontally at speeds that stung the exposed skin of Arthur's face and made the familiar landscape of his farm look provisional, uncertain, like a painting not yet dry. By 3 in the afternoon, it was a whiteout. Arthur sat in the kitchen and listened to the radio, which was now carrying a continuous tone alert from the National Weather Service. The same signal they used for tornadoes, which in itself was notable, that the same level of emergency was being assigned to a winter storm as to a summer twister. The temperature had dropped to -6. The wind was clocked at 42 miles per hour at the Champaign County Airport with gusts to 61. Snow was accumulating at 2 inches per hour. The Urbana Daily Citizen would later call the Great Blizzard of 1978 the worst winter storm to hit Ohio in the 20th century. That assessment was not hyperbole. Drifts would reach 20 feet in exposed locations. The Ohio National Guard would be activated. President Carter would declare portions of Ohio a federal disaster area. 26 Ohioans would die from exposure and storm-related accidents in the next 48 hours. Roads across the state would be declared impassable, and many of them would stay that way for 4 and 5 days. But on the afternoon of January 25th, all of that was still becoming. The storm was not yet history. It was present tense, immediate, and relentless. And what it was doing in Champaign County was making the world that existed beyond the walls of Arthur Delaney's farmhouse disappear. He could not see the machine shed from the kitchen window. He could not see the equipment shed. He could barely see the back porch steps. Clyde lay under the kitchen table with his head on his paws, and his eyes tracking Arthur's movements with the calm anxiety of a dog who understands that something large is happening and has decided that proximity to his person is the correct response. Arthur poured another cup of coffee and listened to the weather radio, and, in the particular stillness of a man who has outlived enough storms to know that some of them require patience rather than action, he waited. The county highway garage on the edge of Urbana had been busy since noon. Don Kessler had pulled both Oshkosh units out of the bays at 1 o'clock and sent them east and west on Route 36 to begin pretreatment with road salt before the snow got too deep for prevention. Both trucks were in radio contact with the highway garage dispatcher, a woman named Sandy, who sat at her console with a cup of coffee and a pack of Virginia Slims and coordinated with the county sheriff's office on the radio. Oshkosh Unit 1, going east on Route 36, had made it as far as the Mutual Road intersection, about 4 miles out, when the driver, a county employee named Mike Schreiber, who had run the old trucks for 6 years and the new ones for a season, came on the radio and reported that the engine temperature gauge was behaving strangely. Sandy noted the time, 2:47 p.m. She asked him if he wanted to come back to the garage. Schreiber said no, it was probably just the gauge, the truck felt fine, he would push on to Woodstock and come back. At 3:15, Schreiber came on the radio and reported that the engine had begun to run rough and the truck had lost about half its power. He pulled to the side of Route 36, set his flashers, and called for assistance. Oshkosh Unit 2, running west toward St. Paris, had a different problem. Its driver, a younger man named Curtis Webb, reported at 3:22 that his engine had died completely, with no warning, while moving at normal plowing speed. He had attempted a restart and gotten nothing. He described the condition of the engine, slow cranking, then no cranking at all, as if the starter was pulling against something that wasn't there. Sandy, who was not a diesel mechanic but who had been listening to diesel problems described over the radio for 11 years, sat very still for a moment and then picked up the phone and called Don Kessler's office. Kessler called his superintendent of equipment, a man named Dave Alt, who drove out to Unit 2 in a county pickup and spent 20 minutes looking at it in the blowing snow, and then called Kessler back and said 3 words that Kessler had been afraid to hear: fuel gel problem. The diesel fuel in both Oshkosh trucks, the $40,000 machines with the 8V71 power plants, and the enclosed heated cabs, had begun to gel. The paraffin waxes in the diesel had precipitated out of suspension in the extreme cold, and the resulting semi-solid material had clogged the fuel filters and, in Unit 2's case, had found its way into the injection system itself. Neither truck was going to run without being towed to a heated facility and having its fuel system flushed with number 1 diesel or kerosene, a process that would take several hours under ideal conditions, and these conditions were not ideal. Don Kessler sat in his office at the county garage with the phone in his hand and the temperature outside dropping to -14, and both of his $40,000 snowplows sitting dead on county roads, and he thought about what Harold Fitch was going to say. And then he thought about something more urgent than Harold Fitch. The roads were not being plowed, and the storm was getting worse. He called the State Patrol. The State Patrol's District 3 office in Springfield was dealing with its own version of the same problem. Trooper Billy Howell had taken the district plow out at 2 in the afternoon on Interstate 70, which was the priority road. The interstate moved freight and cars across the state at speeds that turned ordinary snowfall into extraordinary danger, and keeping it passable was the first duty of the State Patrol's equipment. Howell had made one pass westbound between Springfield and the Clark County line and was heading back east when the engine began to miss. He had noticed the fuel temperature warning light come on 20 minutes earlier, but had assumed it was a gauge issue. These trucks were new, and in his limited experience with them, the gauges sometimes reported things that weren't true. He had kept driving. The miss became a stumble. The stumble became a stall. And Interstate 70 westbound at the Clark-Champaign County line had an 80,000-pound state snowplow sitting dead in the right lane, with its flashers going, and its driver on the radio saying things that District Commander Captain Whitfield was not happy to hear. Whitfield called in every available trooper to assist stranded motorists on the interstate. He put out a notification to the county sheriffs and highway departments across the district that state plow assets were temporarily unavailable. He called the Ohio Department of Transportation District Office and requested emergency assistance, which was also unavailable because ODOT was dealing with the same problem across 11 counties. Billy Howell sat in the cab of the dead state plow, which was still warm from the engine's last effort, and called his girlfriend in Columbus on the CB radio through a relay, and told her he was going to be a while. The Champaign County schools had been slow to cancel. Superintendent of Schools Gerald Whitmore had been watching the weather all morning and had made the calculation. A calculation that school superintendents across the Midwest make every winter with imperfect information and genuine uncertainty, that the storm would not arrive until after the school day ended. He had the afternoon dismissal buses rolling by 2:30, which was the standard time, and by 2:30 the county roads had 4 inches of wind-packed snow on them, and visibility was dropping toward a quarter mile. 19 children from the rural consolidated route, Route 7, were aboard the yellow International Harvester School bus driven by a woman named Helen Marsh, who had been driving that route for 11 years and knew every pothole and low spot and drift-prone ditch between her first stop and the school. Helen was a competent and careful driver, and under normal conditions, even bad winter conditions, she would have been fine. These were not normal conditions. She had dropped 9 children at their stops along Swaggerty Road and County Road 25 without incident and was coming back north on County Road 33, which ran on a slight ridge between 2 shallow valleys, when the wind hit from the northwest with a sustained gust that the meteorologists would later estimate at 63 miles per hour. The road disappeared. Not gradually, not partially. It was there, and then a wall of white was there, and Helen Marsh, who was doing 20 miles an hour and had both hands on the wheel, felt the front left of the bus drop into a ditch she hadn't seen because there was nothing to see. The bus came to rest at an approximately 30-degree angle, driver's side down, nose in the ditch, back end across the road. It was not overturned. All 10 remaining children were unhurt. The engine was still running, and Helen left it running for the heat. She had a CB radio, which was standard equipment on county school buses since 1976, when the county school board, in a moment of progressive thinking that they had been patted on the back forever since, had approved the installation of a base unit and CBs in all buses, partly as a communication tool, and partly because the CB craze was at its cultural apex in 1977 and it seemed like the right thing to do. Smokey and the Bandit had come out that year, and everyone had a CB, and the language of the CB, 10-4, good buddy, Smokey on your 6, had entered the culture the way slang always enters, through popular entertainment and the particular susceptibility of adolescents to novelty. Helen Marsh was not an adolescent, and she did not use CB slang. She picked up the handset, switched to Channel 9, which was the emergency channel, and said, clearly and without drama, "This is Route 7 school bus, Champaign County, Ohio. I have gone into a ditch on County Road 33 approximately 1 mile north of the Troutman Road intersection. I have 10 children aboard, no injuries. I need assistance. Temperature is very cold. Please respond." She released the key and waited. Channel 9 was monitored by the county sheriff's dispatcher, who heard Helen's transmission at 3:41 p.m. and immediately notified the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office notified the county highway department, which notified Don Kessler, who was already on the phone with the state patrol, who were already dealing with Billy Howell's dead plow on Interstate 70. Kessler called Dave Alt and asked how long before either Oshkosh was operable. 3 hours minimum, Alt said. Maybe more. We got to get them to a heated bay first. Kessler sat with the phone and thought. County Road 33 was 2 miles off Route 36. To get to Helen Marsh and 10 children in a school bus ditch with no operable plow equipment, you would have to drive through 2 miles of unplowed road in conditions where visibility was near zero and the temperature was approaching -20 with wind chill. A regular pickup could not make it. The county's backup equipment, an aging 1961 Adams grader, was in the back bay of the garage with a seized hydraulic cylinder and had been waiting for a replacement part since November. He called the sheriff. The sheriff called the state patrol. Captain Whitfield told him that the state patrol's district plow was also disabled and that he had troopers in their vehicles attempting to assist stranded motorists on the interstate, and that his resources were fully committed. "There are children in that bus," the sheriff said. "I understand that," Whitfield said. "I am telling you what I have." A silence. "How long can they survive in there?" Whitfield asked. The sheriff looked out his office window at the white nothing and did some arithmetic that he did not want to do. "If the bus engine keeps running, maybe till morning. If it stops running, maybe 4 hours. Then we need to figure out something else," Whitfield said. The call came to Arthur Delaney's farmhouse at 4:17 p.m. It was not the sheriff's office, and it was not the state patrol. It was Carl Brenneman, Arthur's neighbor from 3 miles west, whose farm sat just off County Road 33 and who had been monitoring the CB radio in his shop, because Carl Brenneman was the kind of man who liked to know what was happening in his county. He had heard Helen Marsh's transmission and every subsequent conversation on Channel 9, and he had watched the county's attempts to organize a response deteriorate over the past 35 minutes into a succession of problems and an absence of solutions. Carl called Arthur on the party line. The phone rang twice, one long and one short, which was the Delaney ring, and Arthur picked up. "Art," Carl said, without preamble. "You heard about the school bus?" "No," Arthur said. Carl told him. He gave him the location, the number of children, the condition of the county equipment, the temperature. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that Carl thought the connection had dropped. "Art, I'm here," Arthur said. "Can that M of yours get through 2 miles of unplowed road in this?" Another silence, shorter this time. "I don't know," Arthur said, which was honest, and which Carl Brenneman knew was the most useful answer he was going to get. "I figured I'd ask," Carl said. "You did right," Arthur said. He hung up the phone. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the window, which showed him nothing but white, and then he looked at the coffee percolator, and then he did something he had not done in 7 years, which was walk to the small shelf beside the hallway door where Dorothy had kept her things, her reading glasses, a small bottle of aspirin, a few books, and a framed photograph of the two of them from 1955 standing in front of the new corn crib, and he looked at her face for a moment. Then he put on his gear. The gear was the product of 40 winters of iterative improvement. Long underwear, the wool kind, not the synthetic kind that was beginning to appear in stores in the late 70s. Wool stayed warm when wet, a fact that Arthur considered fundamental. Heavy denim bib overalls over that. A flannel shirt. Over the overalls, a set of insulated coveralls, Carhartt brand, brown, that he had owned since 1969, and that had been patched in 4 places with iron-on denim patches that Dorothy had applied with such competence that the patches had outlasted the original fabric around them. Wool socks, 2 pair. Pack boots, the insulated rubber-over-leather boot with the removable felt liner, standard cold-weather footwear for Midwest farmers of that era. A wool sweater under the coveralls. Over all of it, a canvas work coat with a blanket lining that had belonged to his father, and that still had a square of gum in the right-hand pocket that had been there, Arthur was fairly certain, since before the Second World War. Heavy wool mittens over liner gloves. A wool cap pulled down over his ears. A wool scarf wrapped twice around his neck and lower face. He looked like what he was, a man built for the outside of a cold machine in bad weather, layered and practical, and without any of the modern synthetic fiber sophistication that the sporting goods stores in Springfield were beginning to sell. He weighed, in this configuration, about 215 pounds, and he moved through the back door and across the yard toward the machine shed with the deliberate economy of a man who knows that in extreme cold, wasted motion is wasted heat, and wasted heat is wasted time. The machine shed was cold. Arthur had insulated it when he built it in 1952, fiberglass bats between the studs, an investment that had seemed extravagant at the time and had paid off in every subsequent winter, but it was not heated, and the temperature inside was probably 5 or 6 degrees above the outdoor temperature, which meant it was somewhere between -12 and -15 Fahrenheit. His breath made a solid white cloud. The flashlight he kept on the shelf inside the door threw a beam that caught every particle of condensation and made the air look populated. He went to the M. It sat in its corner of the shed like it always had. The red paint faded in the way that good paint fades, not peeling or chalking but deepening, taking on a complexity that new paint never has. The blade was mounted on the front. The tractor looked, in the flashlight beam, very much like what it was, 29 years old, built to work, built to last, built without a single component that could not be understood and repaired by a man with ordinary tools and ordinary intelligence. Arthur checked the battery terminals first, not because the M needed the battery to run once the engine was turning, but because a battery could at least assist the starting process. The battery was cold, and a cold battery was a weak battery, and a weak battery might not turn the engine fast enough to fire, especially if the oil had thickened in the cold. He cleaned the terminals with his jackknife blade, pressed them tight. He opened the petcock on the fuel line and let it flow for a moment to confirm there was no gelation. There wasn't, because gasoline doesn't gel. He checked the choke, which on the M was a manual pull-out knob on the instrument panel that restricted airflow through the carburetor to create a rich mixture for cold starting. He pulled the choke out to its full position. He climbed into the seat. There was no cab door to open, no steps to worry about, just the left rear wheel and the platform and the iron seat, and turned the key to start. The battery turned the engine twice, slow and labored, and nothing happened. The battery was too cold to do more. He climbed back down. He went to the nail by the shed door and took the hand crank. This was a ritual that very few men under the age of 60 in 1978 still knew how to perform. Most tractor engines of the post-war era could theoretically be hand-cranked, but most farmers had never done it on anything more modern than a pre-war machine, and the practice had faded along with the pre-war machines themselves. Arthur had hand-cranked the M twice before, once in 1952 when the battery had failed completely during a cold snap, and once in 1961 when the starter motor brushes had worn out in December and the replacement part had taken 4 days to arrive from the IH dealer in Columbus. Both times he had done it carefully, correctly, because hand-cranking a running engine is one of those tasks where a mistake has immediate and serious consequences. The technique is important. You do not grip the crank with your thumb wrapped around the handle. You fold the thumb alongside the fingers, so that if the engine kicks back, which it will do if the timing is slightly advanced, or if the cylinder fires on the compression stroke before you expect it, the crank will knock your hand away rather than breaking it. Arthur's father had lost 2 fingers on the knuckle of his right hand to a kickback on a Farmall regular in 1934, and he had explained the proper grip to Arthur in the same tone of voice he used for everything that had cost him something to learn. Arthur inserted the drive end of the crank into the front socket. He pulled the choke all the way out. He made sure the throttle was set to half. He made sure the magneto switch was on. Then he bent his back and pulled. The crank turned. Heavy, resistant, the cold oil making the engine stiff. He pulled through half a revolution, then a full revolution, then a second full revolution. Nothing. The engine was cold to the bones, and the oil was thick as honey, and the crank required every pound of force he had. And at 72, he had somewhat less force than he had had at 40, which had been somewhat less than at 30, but what he had at 72 that he had not had at 30 was the knowledge of exactly how to apply what he had. so that no effort was wasted and every ounce of it went to the task. He pulled again. On the fifth pull, a cough. A single explosive cough from the exhaust pipe, a puff of blue smoke, and then silence again. He was encouraged. One cylinder had fired. The engine had compression and spark. The fuel was reaching the carburetor. The rest was persistence. He pulled again, and twice more. On the ninth pull, the engine caught. It did not catch smoothly. It coughed and stumbled and ran on 2 cylinders, and then 3, and then all 4, the exhaust note going from ragged to rough to a rolling, heavy, deep-throated idle that shook the shed walls and made Clyde, who had followed Arthur from the house and was standing in the shed doorway, back up a step with his ears pressed flat. The exhaust was white, heavy, solid, superheated water vapor from the cold engine condensing in the even colder air. The M sat and shook and ran, and the sound of it filled the shed and went out through the walls into the storm. And it was a very particular sound. It was the sound of a machine that worked. Arthur climbed back into the seat and pushed the choke halfway in and gave the engine 2 minutes to warm, watching the oil pressure gauge climb from 0 to 35 pounds and hold there. He felt the vibration of the engine through the iron seat and through the platform and into his boots and up through his legs, the specific vibration of a 4-cylinder engine at low idle. A frequency he had felt so many thousands of times over 30 years that he recognized it the way you recognize a voice, not just as sound, but as character. He pushed the choke in the rest of the way. The idle smoothed. He put the M in gear and drove it out of the shed into the storm. The visibility was approximately 0. Not reduced, not poor, not limited 0. The flashlight beam was useless, swallowed by driving snow at a distance of 6 feet. The M's headlights, a pair of sealed beam units that had been adequate in normal conditions, illuminated only the snow itself, a white wall moving horizontally from left to right with the force of the wind. Arthur killed the headlights after the first 50 yards. They were worse than nothing. They reflected back from the snow and reduced his dark-adapted vision to pure confusion. He drove by memory. His farm was 3 miles south of where Helen Marsh's bus was stuck on County Road 33, and the route required him to turn north on the Swaggerty Road, which was a gravel county road without windbreaks on either side, then east on County Road 33. He had driven these roads so many times over so many decades that they existed in him as a kind of physical knowledge, the way a blind man learns a house. Not visually, but proprioceptively, in the body's memory of distance and direction and the particular way the ground behaves at each familiar point. The first challenge was the end of his own lane, where the ditch on the north side of the township road had a tendency to accumulate drifts. The drift was there, 3 feet, maybe 4, compressed by wind into something that was no longer entirely snow but not yet entirely ice, something in between. The M hit it at a walking pace, and the blade caught it and pushed, and Arthur felt the machine slow, and he felt the front wheels trying to climb the drift, and he held his line by the feel of the steering wheel in his hands, and by the tilt of the seat beneath him, and by 40 years of understanding how a tractor moves through resistance, and after 10 seconds that felt longer, the drift yielded, and the blade pushed through it, and Arthur was on the township road. The temperature was reading 22 below on the thermometer on the shed wall when he left. On the seat of the Farmall M, with the wind coming at him from the northwest at 50 miles per hour, he was exposed to conditions that by any rational measure should have driven him back. His face, covered by the wool scarf from bridge of nose to collar, was still receiving wind chill. The wind found the gaps between his cap and his scarf, and between his mittens and his cuffs, and between his coveralls and his boots, and it worked at these gaps with the patient thoroughness of a thing that is all the time in the world and knows it. Arthur leaned slightly into the wind, which was coming over his left shoulder, and drove. He found Swaggerty Road by the feel of it. A gravel road has a different texture than a dirt lane under snow, a slight roughness that communicates through the front wheels and up the steering column to hands that know what they are feeling for. He turned north. The wind was now directly on his left side, coming across an open field with nothing between him and the storm from here to the Michigan border, and it was extraordinary, not as a noun, but as an adjective, beyond ordinary, beyond the ordinary scale of cold and wind that even an Ohio winter usually produces. The M rocked on its springs in the gusts, and Arthur compensated with his body weight, leaning to maintain his line. He had brought the CB radio from the kitchen, a handheld unit he had bought 2 years earlier and used primarily for weather updates during harvest. He had put it inside his coveralls, against his body, to keep the battery warm. He tried it now, pulling it out with his right hand while his left held the wheel. "This is Delaney, County Road south of the bus. I'm coming north on Swaggerty Road with a plow. Is there anybody on Channel 9 who can give me the bus driver's ears?" Static. Then, copy that. This is Champaign County Sheriff's Dispatch. Can you identify? Arthur Delaney. I'm 3 miles south of the bus on a Farmall M with a blade. Somebody tell that bus driver to turn her lights on when she hears my engine. She won't hear it far in this wind. Maybe 50 yards. A pause. Then, copy that, Mr. Delaney. We're going to relay that message. Can you give us your ETA? Arthur thought about this. He was doing approximately 3 miles per hour in these conditions. 3 miles. An hour. An hour, he said. Give or take. A longer pause. Then the dispatcher came back, and her voice had something in it that was not standard radio protocol, something that was simply a human being talking to another human being. Copy that. You be careful, Mr. Delaney. 10-4, Arthur said, which was the only CBSA he knew, and he put the radio back inside his coveralls. He drove. The north end of Swaggerty Road required him to navigate a low-water crossing over Sycamore Creek, which ran under the road through a corrugated metal culvert that tended to ice over in extreme cold and create a glare patch on either side. He found it by feel, the slight drop in elevation that preceded any creek crossing, the way the M's front end dipped just slightly as the grade changed, the different sound the tires made on the ice versus the packed snow. He held his breath crossing it, because the M weighed 7,000 pounds and the culvert was not young. And then he was across and the grade was rising, and he was on the north side of Swaggerty Road where it T-intersected with County Road 33. He turned east. The bus was somewhere to his right, northeast of him. The county road ran along the ridge, and the drift patterns here were serious. Not the steady 3-foot drift of the open field, but the variable, treacherous drifts of a ridge road, some of them 6 feet high in the windward angles, some of them bare and wind-scoured to the gravel. The M's blade was working continuously, pushing and pushing, and Arthur was working the wheel hard, compensating for the way the heavy blade wanted to walk the front end downhill on the left side. He found the bus by its lights. He was within 40 yards before he saw them, not headlights, which Helen had turned off to save fuel, but the amber running lights on the roof of the bus, barely visible through the driving snow, and then the hazard flashers, orange, pulsing. He steered toward them and the M's headlights, which he had turned back on at slow speed where they might do some good, picked up the yellow metal of the school bus nose down in the right ditch, rear end sitting high. The bus at that sickening angle that means it went off fast and hard. He stopped the M alongside the bus and climbed down, which took more effort than it would have taken at 40 and required him to hold the rear fender with both hands and ease himself down, because at 72, jumping off anything was not wise. His joints screamed briefly in the cold, and then subsided into the dull ache that had been his companion for years. He walked to the bus door. The door was on his right, slightly elevated because of the angle, and knocked on the glass. Helen Marsh's face appeared, pale and set with the expression of a woman who has been managing scared children for an hour with limited resources and has done it well, but who is very ready to be finished doing it. She pulled the lever and the door opened with its characteristic pneumatic hiss. "Took you long enough," she said, and immediately looked like she might cry, which she did not do. "Roads are bad," Arthur said. From inside the bus came the sound of 10 children ages 6 through 14, who had been frightened and cold and had been telling themselves they were not for the past hour and a half, and who now looked at a 72-year-old man in a canvas coat and Carhartt coveralls standing in the open door of their tilted bus and understood that someone had come for them, and reacted to that understanding in the various ways that children react to relief. "Is everybody all right?" Arthur asked. "Everybody's all right," Helen said. "Good. I'm going to hook a chain to the bus. Then I'm going to pull it out of the ditch. Then I'm going to take it slow back to the road. Then you follow me back to town. You understand?" "I understand," Helen said. 10 miles an hour the whole way," Arthur said. "Stay directly behind me. You'll be able to see the blade." "All right." He went to the front of the M, where he kept a log chain hooked to the front drawbar bracket. A heavy chain, 3/8 inch, 12 feet long, good for several tons of pull. He took the free end and walked it to the rear of the school bus, where the standard tow hook was located on the frame rail. And he clipped the chain to the hook with a clevis pin that he had to work with both hands because the clevis was stiff with cold and his mittens were not conducive to fine motor work. Then he climbed back on the M, which was harder than climbing off, and engaged the rear drive carefully and took up the slack in the chain slowly, feeling the tension build through the drawbar. And when he felt the tension go solid, he put the M in low gear and opened the throttle. The Farmall M pulled. It did not pull with the ease that $40,000 of hydraulic engineering provides. It pulled the way everything powerful and simple pulls, by applying itself completely to the problem, without reservation, making no calculations about what might happen if it failed. The wheels spun briefly on the icy road, and then found grip, and the engine note dropped as the load came on, and the chassis flexed, and the front end of the bus came up out of the ditch slowly, reluctantly, the metal frame popping as it moved, and then it was up, tilting back to level, and it was on the road. Arthur stopped the M. He walked back and unhooked the chain and coiled it back over the front bracket. He walked to the bus door. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," Helen said. The return trip took 90 minutes. 3 miles at 2 miles per hour, the M plowing and pushing and grinding its way south and west through conditions that had not improved, and that Arthur did not expect to improve until sometime the following day. The bus followed behind him, its headlights steady, Helen Marsh's hands white on the wheel at 10 hours and 2 o'clock the way she had been taught in the commercial driver's class 20 years ago. The children in the bus were quiet. Some of them watched the red tractor ahead of them with expressions that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The image of a small, slow, ancient piece of machinery moving through the worst weather most of them had ever seen, red paint visible through the white, the exhaust pipe trailing a steady plume of steam. Arthur did not look back. He drove. He navigated the low-water crossing again, slower this time with the bus behind him. The bus was heavier than the tractor, and the ice was worse after another hour of cold. And he felt the back end of the M skitter slightly on the ice, and he held it with the wheel, and kept his speed, and the M did what it had always done, which was continue. He found his way back down Swaggerty Road by the same method he had used coming north, by the feel of the road, by the tilt of the grade, by the memory in his hands of 40 years of driving this ground. When they reached the intersection with the township road, he turned the M east toward the Troutman farm, which had a big barn and a propane heater in the shop, and where Leon Troutman, who had heard the situation on his own CB, had the overhead door open and the coffee on. Leon came out in his coveralls as the bus rolled into his yard, and then Sandra Troutman came out, and then their 2 teenage boys, and then there was the business of getting 10 cold children off a school bus and into a warm shop, and the phone calls to parents, and the sound of children crying with relief rather than fear, which is a very different sound, and Leon and Sandra and their boys doing what Midwestern farm families have always done when neighbors arrive in need, which is move, without discussion or ceremony, to provide warmth and food and whatever is needed, without drama, simply because that is what you do. Arthur sat on the M in the Troutman driveway for a while, letting the engine idle down before he shut it off. He was very cold. His hands, inside 2 layers of mittens, had lost some sensation in the little fingers. His face, below the scarf, had the wooden feeling that means the skin is beginning to struggle. He knew that he would be all right. He had been cold before, often, and he knew the difference between cold that is dangerous and cold that is merely uncomfortable, and this was near the edge of dangerous, but not across it. He shut the M down. The engine ticked as it cooled. He sat for a moment in the silence of the storm. Sandra Troutman appeared in the driveway with a mug of coffee, held up with both hands in the cold. Arthur climbed down from the M, carefully, both hands on the fender, and took the mug and drank from it without speaking for a moment. "Come inside," Sandra said. "In a minute," Arthur said. He stood beside the M and drank the coffee, which was hot and strong, and was the best cup of coffee he had ever had, or felt like it. And he looked at the M in the yellow lights spilling from the shop door. The front blade had a dent in it from a particularly stubborn drift on the way back. The front tires were packed solid with snow. The exhaust pipe was still warm, ticking. He put his hand on the iron hood, the red paint cold through his mitten. "Attaboy," he said, very quietly, the way you say something to a thing that can't hear you but that you want to say it to anyway. Then he went inside. The storm broke sometime in the early morning hours of January 26th. The wind dropped. The snow stopped. The temperature remained severe, -18 at dawn, but the sky cleared to the absolute, ferocious blue of a winter morning after a bad storm, the kind of blue that has no compromise in it, that is so purely itself that it almost hurts. Arthur drove the M home at first light, the blade pushing the last of the night's accumulation off his lane, and put it in the shed and fed the cattle and made breakfast, eggs and toast and coffee, and sat at the kitchen table and listened to the radio, which was now playing a continuous stream of reports from across Ohio and Indiana and Michigan about the damage the blizzard had done. The reports were extensive. Dozens of deaths, hundreds stranded, thousands of miles of road closed. The National Guard deployed. Federal disaster declaration pending. The Great Blizzard of 1978, the radio called it, which Arthur thought was probably right. He heard, in passing, about the county's snowplows, both disabled before the worst of the storm, and about the State Patrol's highway unit, dead on Interstate 70. He heard the county commissioner on the local station at 7:30, explaining the fuel gelling problem to a reporter who did not seem to fully understand it, and explaining what steps would be taken to prevent it from happening in the future. He poured a second cup of coffee. The phone rang at 8 o'clock. It was the sheriff himself, Bill Harrington, who had been sheriff of Champaign County for 12 years and who Arthur knew slightly, in the way that a man knows the sheriff of a small county, by reputation more than acquaintance. "Mr. Delaney," Harrington said, "I understand you brought in Helen Marsh's bus last night." "We got the children home," Arthur said. "Yes, sir, you did. I'd like to express the county's appreciation. That was a remarkable thing. Roads needed plowing," Arthur said. A pause. The county's equipment was unavailable. Both Oshkosh units had fuel gelling problems, as did the State Patrol unit. "I heard," Arthur said. Another pause, and in it Arthur could feel the sheriff trying to say something that was not quite forming into words, something about the gap between what the county had spent and what it had been able to do, something about an old man on an old tractor, something about what it means to be adequate to a moment. He did not say it, not in so many words. "I'd like to bring a reporter out, if that's all right," Harrington said. "The Urbana Daily Citizen. They'd like to do a story." "No, thank you," Arthur said. "Mr. Delaney, I appreciate the call, Sheriff. You have a good day." He hung up the phone. He sat in the kitchen with his coffee. Clyde got up from under the table and pushed his head against Arthur's leg, and Arthur reached down without looking and scratched behind the dog's ear, and the dog's tail moved slowly back and forth in the way of dogs who are content. The Urbana Daily Citizen ran the story anyway, on January 28th, with the headline, "School Bus Rescued During Blizzard. Local Farmer's 1949 Tractor Succeeds Where Modern Plows Failed." The story was 2 columns, above the fold, with a photograph that Carl Brenneman had taken from a distance, a small, blurry image of the red Farmall M in the Troutman driveway, the school bus visible behind it, both of them haloed in the yellow light of the shop door. Arthur was in the photograph, but was not easily recognizable. He was turned slightly away and was little more than a bundled figure in a canvas coat. He read the article sitting at the kitchen table. He thought it was mostly accurate. He cut it out and put it in the drawer with the other papers he kept, the deed to the farm, his marriage certificate, the document from the Ohio Department of Agriculture certifying 120 bushels per acre average yield in his best corn year, 1972. He did not show it to anyone. 3 weeks after the blizzard, on a cold but clear Saturday in mid-February, Arthur drove the M out to the north field where he had been meaning to check a fence line that he suspected had been damaged by the storm's drifts. The sky was that winter blue again, hard and clear, and the snow lay in the fields in the patterns that wind makes, long ridges and shallow valleys, like a frozen ocean caught between waves. The Farmall M moved through it with the unhurried authority of a machine that has been doing this for 30 years and is in no particular hurry. He found the fence along the north line and walked it on foot, checking the posts. 3 had been pushed out of plumb by drift pressure, which was a manageable problem. He made notes in his head, locations, materials needed, the order of operations for the spring repair. He climbed back on the M and sat for a moment before starting the engine. From the north field on a clear day, he could see a long way. The Brenneman Place to the west, the white spire of the First Methodist Church in Mutual Township to the north, the water tower on the edge of Urbana visible in the middle distance. The landscape was old and familiar and unchanged in its fundamental character by anything that had happened to it in his lifetime, or in his father's lifetime, or in any lifetime that he could trace. He thought about the children on the bus. He thought about Helen Marsh's face when the door opened. He thought about the Oshkosh trucks with their Detroit diesels and their heated cabs, sitting dead in the cold like enormous, expensive paperweights. He thought about Trooper Billy Howell, who had been quoted in the Urbana Daily Citizen article as saying that the cold had been beyond any specs the equipment was rated for, which was either true or was the kind of thing a young man says when he needs a technical explanation for a human failure. He thought about his father handing him the deed in 1938 and saying, "Don't let the bank get it," and about all the things that that phrase contained, not just the financial instruction, but the whole philosophy that came with it, the understanding that a piece of land and the life built on it were fragile things requiring constant vigilance, and that vigilance required tools that worked when you needed them to work, not tools that looked impressive in a newspaper photograph and failed in the first serious test. He thought about the magneto. He thought about the hand crank on its nail inside the shed door. He thought about the fact that the Farmall M did not have a heated cab, which meant that in order to operate it in extreme cold you had to accept the cold and dress for it, and be in it and understand it, rather than being insulated from it in a climate-controlled environment that allowed you to forget that it was there. He had thought, when Carl Brenneman described his John Deere 4440, that the problem with the heated cab was exactly what he'd said it was. It made you forget that the work was happening. And a man who forgets that the work is happening is a man who is eventually surprised by it. The work never stopped happening. The cold never stopped being cold. The ditch never stopped being where the ditch was. He started the M. It started on the second turn of the key, the battery strong in the clear winter air, and he put it in gear and drove back south across the snow field toward the farmstead, the red machine moving through the white landscape with its steady, rolling sound, trailing a white breath of exhaust against the blue sky. Carl Brenneman's John Deere 4440 was sold in 1984, traded on a bigger machine with more horsepower and a better cab, which was in turn traded in 1989. By the mid-1990s, the Brenneman farm had been absorbed by a larger operation out of Columbus, and the farmhouse was rented, and the machine shed where the 4440 had spent its winters was empty. The county's Oshkosh plows were retrofitted with winterized fuel systems after the 1978 incident, and a blend of No. 1 and No. 2 diesel was mandated for all county equipment operating at temperatures below 20 degrees. They gave good service for many years after that. Don Kessler retired in 1983. Trooper Billy Howell was eventually promoted to corporal and transferred to a district office in Columbus, where he spent 20 years in Highway Patrol Administration before retiring. Harold Fitch lost his re-election bid in 1980, partly due to the blizzard story and partly due to other things. Dale Furrow, the agricultural agent, left the county extension office in 1982 to take a position with an agribusiness consulting firm in Cincinnati. Arthur Delaney farmed his 160 acres until 1991, when he was 85 years old, and his son Robert, who had been coming down from Urbana to help with the heavy work for several years, sat down with him at the kitchen table and had a conversation that was the hardest conversation either of them had ever had, and that ended, after a long time, with Arthur nodding slowly and saying, "I know. I just need you to know I know." He sold the cattle first, then the hog operation, then gradually drew back from the row cropping, leasing the ground to a young family from the next township who put in soybeans and paid their rent on time and kept the place up. He kept the Farmall M. It was in the machine shed when Arthur died in the spring of 1997, at the age of 91, in the farmhouse he had lived in since 1938, in the bed he had shared with Dorothy for 33 years. Robert found him in the morning, peaceful, the radio on the windowsill broadcasting the NOAA weather update for Champaign County. Overnight low of 34 degrees, high pressure moving in, clear and cold through the weekend. The M was eventually acquired by a collector from Indiana, a retired IH dealer's son who restored old iron and who knew, when he saw the tractor, that it was a machine with history in it. Not just the mechanical history of the type, but a specific history, this specific machine, this particular red. Robert told him the story. The collector listened to all of it, standing in the shed in the cold, his hands in his jacket pockets. When Robert was finished, The collector was quiet for a moment. Did it ever break down? The collector asked. The tractor. Did it ever let him down? Robert thought about that for a while. Once, he said. The carburetor stuck open in the summer of 1963 and flooded the engine. He walked back to the house and ate lunch and came back out and fixed it in about 45 minutes. The collector nodded. He walked around the M slowly, looking at it, touching it in places, the blade, the exhaust manifold, the hand crank bracket on the front. He stopped at the seat. What happened to the crank, he said. Robert went to the nail by the shed door. The crank was there, where it had always been, where Arthur had put it back after he was done with it on the night of January 25, 1978. He handed it to the collector, who held it with both hands and looked at it for a long time. A simple iron bar with a bent handle, 18 inches long, unremarkable except for what it had done and for the hands that had used it. It goes with the tractor, Robert said. Of course, the collector said. The children from Helen Marsh's bus were mostly in their 40s and 50s by the time the story was widely told. Told the way farm country stories get told, slowly, across decades, growing gradually more detailed and more accurate as the people who were there got old enough to understand what had actually happened. Some of them remembered the night clearly, the tilt of the bus, the cold, the long wait, and then the lights. Some of them remembered it only as fragments, the way children remember what frightens them, a yellow glow through white, a sound coming out of the storm, and then a door opening and a bundled figure in a canvas coat, and the knowledge that the night was going to end. One of the children, a girl named Patricia Schroeder who had been 7 years old and who grew up to be a high school history teacher in Urbana, wrote about it once, in a newsletter for a local historical society. She wrote, "What I remember most is not the fear, though there was plenty of that. What I remember is the moment when Mr. Delaney appeared at the door of the bus. He didn't say anything dramatic. He asked if everyone was all right, and he told us what he was going to do, and then he went and did it. I have thought about that a great deal in the years since, the plainness of it, that the man who came for us in the worst storm I have ever seen was not a hero in any dramatic sense, just a farmer in old coveralls who had a tractor that worked and knew how to use it. I have tried to teach my students something about that, though it is a hard thing to reduce to a lesson plan." She also wrote, "I never had the chance to thank him properly. By the time I was old enough to understand what he had done, he was already a very old man and I was too shy, and then he was gone. I regret that. I think about him every winter when it gets very cold and the wind comes out of the northwest, which it does here, and I think about what it must have been like to sit on the seat of that tractor in that storm with nothing between you and the weather but wool and canvas, and to drive anyway." The Farmall M is in a museum now, in a collection of working antique tractors in rural Indiana. It is maintained in running condition, and on certain occasions, shows, demonstrations, educational events, it is started and driven, and it starts readily, because a magneto-equipped gasoline engine that has been properly maintained does not particularly care what year it is or what the temperature is, and the old red machine has not forgotten how to do what it was made to do. On the placard beside it, there is a paragraph about the blizzard of 1978 and about Arthur Delaney, and at the bottom of the paragraph, in smaller type, there is a single sentence that one of the museum volunteers, a retired Indiana farmer in his 70s who had grown up with Farmall equipment, had suggested, and that the museum's director, seeing its rightness, had kept. The simplest tools, in the right hands, are often the last ones standing. People stop at that placard for a long time. The older ones especially, the men and women who grew up in the decades when machines were made to be understood and fixed and relied upon. When a farmer who could not diagnose and repair his own equipment was not a farmer who would farm for long. When the relationship between a man and his machinery was not a commercial relationship, but something closer to a partnership, built on mutual knowledge and mutual trust, and the shared understanding that the work would always be harder than the planning suggested, and that you were on your own out there, in the cold, and what you had was what you'd prepared. They look at the red paint, faded and deepened by time. They look at the iron seat, the unshielded steering wheel, the simple gauge cluster, the exhaust pipe pointed straight up toward the sky. They look at the hand crank, hanging on a nail driven into the side of the placard post, exactly where it would have been in the shed. And sometimes one of them reaches out and touches it, the way you touch something that belongs to the past you came from, that holds something of the world that made you. and they stand there for a moment in whatever silence they carry, and then they nod, and they walk on. For all the men and women who kept the old iron running, you know who you are.